Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the world as an expression of His beauty and His goodness. And He has placed the greatest, most miraculous concentration of beauty in His creation, in the beauty of women. And every culture has always known that. The artists and the poets have always celebrated that as being the most extraordinary manifestation of beauty, of Jamal, in Allah's creation. Of course, that is to be celebrated, but it's also the case that in the Semitic tradition in particular, not everybody has the right to gaze upon particularly intense concentrations of holiness. So in the ancient temple of Sayyidina Sulaiman in Jerusalem, the Holy of Holies was always covered by a veil. Similarly, in a Catholic church, the sacrament will often be in a little tabernacle that's covered by a veil. And similarly, in the context of Islam, you could say that the Kaaba is also veiled. The kiswa, the shroud over the Kaaba, is in a sense the hijab of the most spectacular symbol of the divine absoluteness and eternity that exists in this world. So the hijab really is not a sign that something is unworthy or impure or dangerous. Rather, it's an expression of the presence of holiness. And that generally is the way Muslims have responded to the miracle of beauty. So it is a way, as it were, of emphasizing the otherness, the apartness. So, for instance, a word for women in Arabic is harim, but the word for our sanctuary in Mecca is the hara. It's a particular concept of an enclosure in which the sacred is manifested and displayed. That's something hard for us to understand in our civilization, because beauty is the thing that is least understood and is most commercialized. So the face of the woman, even though nobody knows that this is a manifestation of the divine created power, it's a signpost to something higher, not an end in itself, is used and commercialized on the front cover of every magazine and every TV show, because people still have some dim sense that here is something transcendent. In the beauty of woman, there is a sign of transcendence. Even the most dead-hearted atheist still is inspired by that. But of course what they don't have is a way of setting that off and of sanctifying it and of demonstrating that it has to be in its due context. We wouldn't feel right if the Kaaba was unveiled. Certain sacred things are set around with barriers and liminal zones. And so it is with the miracle of female beauty, that in the context of Islam, our way of expressing reverence for it is to set it apart, to treat it with dignity, to surround it and the whole persona of women, particularly in public space, with actually quite severe regulations about deportment and modesty and self-effacement that again are not there to deny her, but to acknowledge the sometimes unruly power that the disclosure of beauty in the public space can bring about. I think it's not just a problem for women, it's a problem for men, and possibly even more for men, because it's harder for women, given their fitrah, to be taken away from the fitrah in an absolute way, because there's a certain way in which their embodiedness necessarily connects them to the world through childbirth, for instance. Men can get further away from their bodies, and you see that in teenage years in Western societies, that it tends to be male teenagers who are most ill at ease with themselves and often malfunction more significantly than the females, because they don't know what it is to be male any longer, whereas there's still an obvious function that is implicit to be female, which tends to center young women to a considerable extent. Having said that, the modern workplace is really designed in order to inculcate us or initiate us into a civilization that does not recognize the good life, but rather recognizes the managed pursuit of pleasures. There is no higher purpose of the modern world, unlike almost all traditional civilizations where everything existed thanks to a unifying principle that pointed up towards the transcendent realm. Now we just exist in order to get more of the same, in order to compete, in order to be amused, to be entertained. And that means that there is no centering principle, and hence the workplace in particular, there is no opportunity for serenity, for calmness, for decompressing. And often people get into quite severe emotional and psychological, suddenly spiritual states as a result. The first antidote to that is, of course, the prayer and scrupulousness in the prayer, because the prayer takes precedence over the meeting, the bus, whatever it might be, it's not negotiable. Secondly, we need to find ways, whether we're men or women, of sacralizing the working day. So, for instance, if you have a private habit, if I did something wrong, or I said something that wasn't quite right, or I was lazy, I'm going to impose upon myself putting £1 in the sadaqah box that I keep on my desk. So there's some sense of accountability in your own private working practices. A sense at the end of the day that you look back over the day's work to see whether your intention was right, whether you were operating in a correct and more adab, a decent way with colleagues, whether you're wasting the time, wasting your employers' resources, and overall to see if you can turn all of those distracted things if you did during the day into parts of a whole, and the whole is to earn a halal income, to improve society, to support your family, and ultimately to serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without that unifying principle, our lives are going to be all over the place. Modesty is something that is innate. Human beings, even quite young children, very quickly develop a sense, even if they're never told, that it's wrong to be naked when people are looking. It's something that's natural to human beings. And that's been the case since the end of the paradisal era with Adam and Hawa. It's part of the fitrah. We're disconnected from the fitrah in the modern world. And there is, as a result, no real sense of how we can use this natural desire to be modest, to be self-contained, not to project ourselves physically in a way that's distracting to others. How we can use that fitri desire in a way that actually has a practical outcome. It's not just about body language and comportment and the kind of things that we can say, we can't say. It's something more profound. So coming into Islam from a non-Muslim background means, in a sense, that one has to relearn, in a sense, the art of being human. Modesty is a fundamental aspect of what we are. The modern world is very immodest, not just after the 9 o'clock watershed, but now everywhere. The great transformations that have happened thanks to liberations of various kinds in the last 50 years in the West have resulted in wall-to-wall obscenity by any traditional standard, and modesty is nowhere celebrated. It's still, when people see it, they're impressed. I think most decent, non-prejudiced British people or American people, if they see a woman who is intelligently and modestly wearing hijab and living that hijab, there's something within them that is impressed by that. Not just because of the sacrifice that she's making, but because she is not part of the world in which everything is commercialized. So it can be, properly applied, a tremendous advertisement for Islam, and people who had their interest in Islam sparked, but just by seeing their hijab and some part of their innate humanity being impressed by the radical turn back to human nature and to modesty and decency and values which the hijab represent. But of course it is difficult. Many people find it a struggle. But then religion is a strong and it's a sacrifice. And Ibrahim was commanded to sacrifice his son. All of the prophets had to make vast sacrifices. Religion offers us paradise, and Allah says that the price of paradise is high, but Allah is merciful. So we rely on Allah's mercy because we can never pay the price of eternity. That would be an infinite price. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks a few little things from us in order to give us the garden that goes on forever. That's because He provides بغير حساب, without reckoning. But still, we have to make that sacrifice. There are certain sacrifices that men have to make. Sometimes if there's a war, the men have to carry the bulk of that responsibility. There's some things that women have primarily to do. That's just part of the way in which Allah has created us as two genders. But the path to paradise is necessarily steep, but we are promised to prophecy that it's worth it. There is no one key that fits every human heart, and people's faith can be reinforced by a huge variety of different things. For some people, it's the contemplation of nature. For others, it's a particular type of litany or prayer. For some, it's the company of other people who reinforce their faith. For some people, it's the scientific miracles of the Quran. There are different keys to different human hearts. The general principle, however, throughout Islamic history has been that we need to remember that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is near. There's nothing in the world which, from a materialistic perspective, is just a set of incredible, improbable paradoxes that is anything other than a display of God's beautiful names. Everything in the world is simply the qualities, the asma of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala interacting with each other in endless, spectacular, beautiful ways. So we need to experience the world as gift. We need to see beauty. And in a sense, you can measure your iman by the percentage of people you meet in whom you see beauty. And many of the sheikhs have said this. If you want to know what's your kind of percentage of iman, see what percentage of people that you meet you find beautiful. Even if they seem to be unlikely, either they're drunks or whatever, you see the beauty in that person, what Allah means them to be, then that means that you are seeing Allah's intentions towards them and the beauty that is placed in that person. And similarly, in everything that we encounter. So we need to be looking for beauty. And we also need to remember the principle of love, of mahabba, which has often been underrated by Muslims, at least in the last few years. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has called himself the most merciful of the merciful, and is not out to get us. The world is not full of kind of traps, so that Allah will say, aha, got you. Allah wishes to call us to paradise, and he's created the world as an infinite range of signposts, all pointing back to him. He's called himself Al-Qarib, the near. So if we fall in love with Allah's names that we see in creation, including the scary stuff that happens, we see the majesty as well as the beauty. If we train our hearts to perceive the divine agency in everything, then inshallah we will see through all of the shadowy thoughts of certain late modern atheists and the troubled characters of Dostoevsky, or whatever superficial thing it might be that's actually triggering something that's deeper within us. Because usually a mental argument only works if there's some kind of spiritual weakness. If the spirit is strong, that is grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's in a state of sabr and rida and shukr and mahabba, then no amount of philosophical niggling is going to make any difference. Because if you've seen the moon, you're not going to pay much attention to people who are arguing about whether it exists or not, or what it looks like. Problem with the scientists is that they just look at the surface and they can't see what's beyond. But faith allows us to look through and see what's really going. For very many people, an appropriate translation of the Quran does unlock surprising things. For some people, they need something cerebral and philosophical because they have certain hang-ups about the problem of evil or the problem of creation or causality, something that they've heard about monotheism that has to be cleared up on a philosophical level. And that's the only way they can get into faith. For other people, they need something that's more heart-oriented, more towards art and beauty, and effective inward dimension of humanity. So they may respond to collections of poetry, for instance. A very good, very simple introduction I've always found is Shaykh Abdul Hakim book, Islam, Religion of Life, which I've given to a wide range of Muslims, and it's always had actually quite a big impact on them. Even though it doesn't get into philosophy or the mysticism or any of those deeper things, it's a basic description of the five pillars and what Muslims believe. Somehow Shaykh Abdul Hakim did manage to pack a lot of good niyyah into that book, and it has a big impact. Works on seerah, also very, very significant, I find. And in terms of Quranic translations, quite often Thomas Cleary's short, kind of selected highlights of the Quran, he calls it the essential Quran, I find is perhaps the best thing to give to the uninitiated non-Muslim, because sometimes for Quran, Surah Fatiha, Surah Al-Baqarah, it's difficult if you're not familiar with the way in which the Quran works. They don't get far enough. But with Cleary's translations, often people do find that opens up the universe from the Quran to some quite surprising people. Well, Allah commands Sayyidina Musa and Harun, وَقُولَا أو قولا لينا لعله يتذكر أو يخشى. In Surah Taha, he tells them, speak to Pharaoh in gentle terms, that perhaps he will remember or fear Allah. So even if it's Fir'aun you're dealing with, who one should really be beating up because of what he's doing, you speak gently And this is the prophetic way, the way of rifq always, and particularly when correcting others. The way of the Salaf was always not to correct them if they knew that there was any difference of opinion on the subject. Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, one of the great Imams of the Tabi'een, used to say, if you find a Muslim doing something that you believe to be haram, but you know that there's a difference of opinion amongst the scholars on that, it's haram for you to try and correct. Because if you just go around trying to force people into your own point of view, then somebody else will be doing it the next view, and the masajid will be nothing but battlegrounds of competing ideologies, which often happens, often is very alienating, confusing. Because people, when they come into a religion, they want clear answers. They don't want a whole bunch of conflicting thoughts. Once you get into Islam, you see that the diversity is actually something beautiful and something that enriches the religion, and that the scholars have tremendous adab and respect for each other. So the real solution is to find a real teacher and to be polite to people who are in the mosque telling you to do something different, but to insist within yourself that you will follow the guidance and instruction of your own teacher, is to be a sheikh authorized in Sharia. Otherwise, you'll just be wandering around on Google forever looking for different fatwas. So one needs to find somebody who's authorized to give fatwa and who has an ijazah, a formally accredited, strictly regulated teaching authority from teachers going right back to great scholars of the past. And historically, Muslims have been very strict about that. You don't take a fatwa or a ruling or opinion or doctrine from anybody unless he can show you a piece of paper that's been authorized to teach that by somebody who thought that he was qualified, and that person who authorized him has been authorized going right back to whoever's tradition it is that's being spoken of, Ahmad bin Hanbal or Ibn Kathir, if it's about his tafsir. That's very important in Islam, that we have accredited scholars. Otherwise, the religion just becomes a sea of questions, and one of the signs of the end of time is that everybody becomes pleased with his own opinion. It's become a little easier than it was 20, 30 years ago in the West, especially if you're in a small town where the local imam might be a part-time dentist who sometimes reads the namaz with a small number of elderly people, but otherwise there's no guidance. It was very difficult. Now it's become a lot easier, partly because of the internet. The internet, of course, is a madhouse in many ways. Every conceivable doiness is out there. But it's also the case that there are some reputable websites, Sunni Path, for instance, where you can study, and websites where you can ask for what is the consensual opinion. Because even if the view seems to be really strange and you're sure that there's no fatwa on it, before we find the scholars have dealt with it, because there are fiqh academies with some pretty slick scholars who have advisors in the relevant discipline. It's quite unusual to find a significant fatwa issue where there isn't actually a fatwa or a settled range of fatwas. Sometimes it takes years for the fatwa to settle down on in vitro fertilization, for instance. It took some time before that was really resolved. Cosmetic surgery issues also disputes amongst scholars, but generally there are views there. It's pretty safe to ask Al-Azhar, and Al-Azhar in the last 5 or 6 years has really updated its technology, and you can ask questions even by text. You can phone Al-Azhar and you leave a message in English, and they promise to get back to you with the answer within 24 hours. They can't turn in directly. There's similar service in Abu Dhabi, which is actually pretty good, carefully regulated. Many of the people who are behind it, and you won't get any wacky fatwas from them. So you have to look around a little bit. There is no Quranic ayah or hadith that dictates what color women's dress has to be. There are certain indications that women of the Sahaba generally would wear black or sometimes white. But it's certainly not a Sharia requirement in any consensual way. The concern is, of course, that the hijab, whose intention is to emphasize the essentially interior nature of womanhood, becomes another way of projecting oneself in the public square, which is what everybody does in one world. This is all about exploring ourselves, expressing ourselves, having a personality, being noticed. But that's not the Islamic way. The Holy Prophet said every religion has a particular quality or character. لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٌ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءُ. And the character trait of Islam is hayat, or modesty. This applies for men as well. It's not just about whether women should look interesting in public. It also affects equally how men are going to dress. If one is dressing in order to attract people's attention or to project oneself or whatever, then there is a moral problem there. And we have to face the fact that human beings do like to dress up, and it's a very strong impulse that we have. And if the hijab is about overcoming that and stressing the spiritual miracle of the face, the emphasis on public decorum, sending out an important moral message. But then there's an ambiguity because her trousers are tight and she's perfumed and she's got lipstick and she kind of looks as if she'd like to be friends with somebody. There's a real paradox there. And non-Muslims will be the first to spot it. They're the first ones to laugh at the girl who wears the tight hijab, but she's wearing the tight jeans and kind of sitting on the table in the classroom and chatting to the boys. That's obviously absurd. That's the worst of both worlds. So the most important thing is once the basic Sharia requirements, everything with the face and hands has been observed, is to watch her body language, to watch her intention, to think about exactly why she wants to wear a certain thing, and to be aware that the shaitan flows in the descendants of Adam along with the blood, as the hadith says, and we're very good at deceiving ourselves. It depends on their aptitude. Some people are very good at dawah and want to join Arab groups and talk to everybody about Islam, very extroverted and will use every opportunity to do dawah, so that when the cold caller comes from Bangalore selling you double glazing, you respond by telling him about Islam. And there's all kinds of ways in which, even if you're at home, you can engage in dawah activities, so you have that kind of personality. The essential responsibility anybody has is, if we are sorted out inside, then good things, inshallah, will happen for others anyway. Even if we seem to be not doing very much in the community, but we're involved in our dhikr and Quran and looking to our children and doing our own thing, but we're concerned to get it right, that will have a big impact on people who are kind of observing us and people who are mixing with our children. And so, Idda biman ta'ul is the prophetic commandment. Begin with your dependents, yourself, make sure you're all right, family, spouse, children, extended family, parent, grandparents, and then on. But you start with the family, because the family unit is fundamental in Islam. Sometimes we tend to be so preoccupied with the far horizons that we forget what's happening around us. And but dawah-oriented Muslims, including myself, tend to have that issue. But the prophetic commandment is clear. We know how much time he spent at home, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. One of the toughest aspects of the sunnah for many Muslim families is the fact that the Holy Prophet did a lot of housework. Not just because it's out of humility, but also because it's a way of being at home, being integrated into the give and take of family life. And that's very important. As often happens, and is probably not unhealthy, there are different opinions on that. The preference is, of course, for there to be no physical contact, and if one can engineer that situation, then that's better. What some rabbinical Jews do, for instance, is to wear a very tight glove that you can hardly notice, go to a big reception. I was at a reception recently in London, and there was a very conservative, orthodox rabbi there. He was shaking everybody's hands, including women, happily, but when I shook his hand, I saw there was something there. I don't think anybody really noticed. It wasn't much of a problem. That's an option that can be considered, so we'll see. Otherwise, we try to...
So it does seem a bit rude when it's sort of in your face, unless you can pretend to keep yourself occupied.
But there's a limit to how many concessions we can make for the sake of politeness. What if somebody wants to kiss you on both cheeks every morning when you come into the office? You can go up. There's an excessive familiarity based on the fact that this is a culture where boundaries are confused. And we do have, alhamdulillah, Sharia, clear boundaries, and that protects us. Sharia is only there to protect us from the rubbish that we do left to our own devices. So, if in doubt, if one possibly can err on the side of caution, sometimes it's difficult. Allah is forgiving, but ultimately, I think it's an individual's judgment call rather than a matter on which we can expect unanimous fatwa from the jurists. Too much concern for the opinions of others is natural and is human, but is not really the religious way. The religious way is to be prepared to face criticism and just put up with it. If one knows that one is following a correct fatwa, one is doing what is right, you just smile and say, thank you, brother, thank you, sister, mashallah. We all have so much to learn, and don't get into a dispute about it. Sometimes just play dumb. That's what I often do. If I'm in the mosque, somebody thinks I'm praying facing the wrong qibla or something, comes up to me, outrage. And I just say, oh, thank you, brother, thank you so much. I did very much. I'm new in Islam. I had some up to that. And that satisfies them, and it's courteous, and they go off. And it doesn't create a situation. But to say, no, see, Sheikh so-and-so says X, and Sheikh so-and-so says Y, and I know this text, turns it into a disputatious matter, which really shouldn't happen in Masajid. So it's an exercise in humility. People criticizing you say, oh, I didn't know very much. Astaghfirullah, thank you so much, sister, and just move on. And inshallah, they'll accept that. But Islam is not about being concerned ultimately with the opinions of people on either side, because Allah is the only judge. And it's our responsibility before Him to ensure that we are following a valid interpretation of His law. And once we're doing that, we have that yaqeen, and our sheikhs are comfortable with the fatwa that we're following. The chit-chat is just something we can be forgiving towards. Islam is based on the beauty of God's law. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ennobled humanity above everything else in creation. Karamna bani Adam. Human beings are more dignified, they have the capacity to know right from wrong, they have more physical beauty, they have intellectual beauty, they can submit to Allah. These are the beings to whom even the angels could prostrate. That which ennobles us maximally is not following what we feel like doing in a particular moment, but conforming to what the Lord of Heaven wishes us to do. And part of Allah's generosity is that He's given us a Sharia with a lot of detail, because our lives have a lot of details. We're in dunya, which is complicated every day. There's dozens of different issues. And in every moment, the believer says, either I can do what I feel like doing, which is the nafs, the ego, slothful pride, showing off, whatever it might be. Or I can conform myself to the sunnah of the chosen one, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. So every little fiqh issue, even if it seems to be small, trivial, even if we don't understand why it's there, is a spiritual opportunity to turn away from the ego and towards the spirit. Once we have that sense, that the sharia and the sunnah are spiritual exercises turning us into noble, self-contained, dignified, calm, happy human beings, rather than just a whole bunch of commandments and prohibitions, which is often how it's projected to us, unfortunately. Once we see it as a spiritual method and a way of recentering ourselves in a crazy world, then the last thing we want to do is take the hijab off or make concessions or whatever, as if the sharia is not Allah's attempt to make things difficult for us. The nafs, the shaitan, want us to have a hard time. If you really follow the nafs, you have a really hard time in your life. That's guaranteed. Allah wishes to protect us from that. He's calling us to be a bird of peace, to salvation. And His method, the unique method for that, is His sharia, and all of it is mercy. Everything that keeps us away from our own rubbish is mercy. And we need to see the sharia as that. And the easiest way of seeing that, and that's really the secret of getting Islam right, really living Islam, loving Islam, is to see the sunnah beautifully practiced by a really saintly human being. When you see the sunnah not as just a bunch of rules that somebody's looked up and is doing and imposing on himself while the ego is rebelling, but to see the complete submission, loving submission of the human soul, the body and mind in the way of the chosen one, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's where you see the beauty of Islam, where it's actually implemented in somebody who's really living it. Once we have somebody like that in our life, then of course, what else do we want to do that follow the sunnah?
So keeping good company, really.
Keeping the company of the best people we can find. Yeah. That makes everything much easier. Imam al-Ghazali has books on fiqh, where he talks in the usual Shafi'i terms about the boundaries of what's permissible in terms of the mingling of the sexes and female dress. There's no surprises there. He's orthodox Shafi'i jurist, and these are essentially fiqh issues. In terms of a profound understanding of gender and what gender means, which is in our homogenizing world where increasingly men and women have the same responsibilities of jobs, expectations, and genders all this being opposed as a principle, which is incredibly impoverishing. When we need to reaffirm that and discover what is it to be a man, what is it to be a woman, how can I inhabit that reality which Allah has bestowed upon me. Imam al-Ghazali is probably not the first port of call for texts such as that, for issues such as that. There are other authors who've written on it. The Japanese writer Sachiko Murata has a very interesting book on gender relations in Islam, Tao of Islam, which is good because it basically is just a huge anthology of what classical scholars have said about the meaning of gender. Actually a very beautiful book. Not everything has to be followed, of course. But
Is it then the English?
it's in English. Yeah, she wrote it in English, Tao of Islam. So that probably is a more appropriate place to begin up when looking at the works of Imam al-Ghazali, who doesn't factor gender into his metaphysic framework, as some of the scholars have done.
That's all the questions.
All done?
Yeah.